A devastating train derailment in Ohio, and we've got lots of issues and things to talk about. And joining us today, Professor of Law at Ohio Northern University, Dr. David Raack. And thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks to be here.
All right, so your area of focus is kind of environmental law. So we see a lot of finger pointing and blaming games already. When it comes to environmental law, what kind of things will happen, do you think, will come out of this train wreck? What will people be looking at, you think?
So in terms of environmental law, there's probably two aspects that are a focus. One is what are the cleanup requirements and processes? And the other is on what we call liability issues. In other words, what is the railroad liable for? Who are they liable to? And in particular, I think in Ohio, there's a question of can the local residents recover for any of their damages or losses? And if so, how does that work?
Okay, so let's start about the cleanup, because that seems to be a concern. You know, the Environmental Protection Agency saying that things are being cleaned up and you know, it's safe, but others are saying that it's not. How do you juggle that? Where does that come in? How do you figure out who is in charge of that cleanup?
Well, I think it's useful to at least recognize for a minute that the local residents' concerns have some basis. They are being told things are safe, but a number of things from their perspective raise questions. Not only was there significant derailment and contamination at the time of the derailment and a fire, but there was a later controlled release and burn off, which it appears put more contaminants at least into the air and maybe into other parts of the environment. Now, for the cleanup process, the way it works is at this point sort of two stages. The first stage, which the EPA says they're moving out of or started to move out of last week, was the emergency response. Under the law that relates to this, the U.S. EPA issued what's called a unilateral administrative order to Norfolk Southern to start cleaning up. So under the main statute and the main federal law that applies here, it's called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, sometimes called CERCLA or the Superfund law. Under that law, the EPA can order, as they have done, a responsible party to do cleanup. And it's a detailed order that the EPA issued last week. It directs the railroad to come up with a work plan that the EPA will approve to start or continue cleaning up. So the EPA says we're moving from the response stage to the cleanup stage, and that the railroad is responsible for doing that. Now, the railroad has to come up with a plan that is subject to EPA approval for cleanup at this point. EPA will continue to have people on site to oversee and direct the cleanup. And if the cleanup doesn't take place as the law requires, which is not only according to that statute, but there's a detailed set of regulations, then the EPA can immediately step back in and take over the cleanup.
This situation is going to have lawmakers look at laws and maybe tweak or see if the laws are proper for this kind of thing?
Yes, I think so. I think there's been enough or a lot of attention paid to this. And so I think we're going to see interest in laws in at least a couple of respects. One is railroad safety. So the braking and the axle systems are currently subject to some safety requirements. I think there's going to be significant interest in increasing those, enhancing those, particularly for railroad and railroad cars that transport hazardous materials. I also think there's going to be an interest or a move to increase transparency so that states and local communities know when hazardous materials are being transported through their areas and in what quantities. As the regulations currently exist and existed at the time of this derailment, because a majority of the cars on the whole train were not carrying hazardous materials, Norfolk Southern didn't have to alert state or local officials that they were transporting these materials. And I think a lot of people now are beginning to wonder, who live near railroads, as many people do, how often are hazardous materials being transported near their communities or in their communities that they're not aware of.
Right, yeah, so many different questions. This is going to be in the news for quite some time, I think.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, don't go away. Noon Edition continues in a moment.